You'd see him going down Route 63 on that old riding mower, rain or shine, like he didn't own a car. Didn't own much of anything, from the looks of him. Same jacket every winter. He lived in the mobile home park, worked as the groundskeeper there. Cut the grass, trimmed the hedges, kept the place tidy. I always felt a little bad for him, honestly. Figured he just never caught a break. Offered him a ride into town once. He waved me off, real polite, and kept riding that mower right past me. Ask almost anyone who lived in Hinsdale, New Hampshire, for the better part of the last 50 years, and you'll get some version of the same story about Geoffrey Holt, told with the same mix of fondness and vague, well-meaning pity. Like they're describing a stray cat that finally learned to trust the neighborhood, rather than a man who quietly out-earned most of the people telling the story. The man on the mower. The groundskeeper with no car and, as far as anyone could tell, no furniture to speak of. A town fixture, a little odd, a little sad. Easy to feel sorry for, and easier still to stop noticing entirely. Almost nobody in that town had the faintest idea that the quiet man mowing the mobile home park's lawn had already, decades earlier, made a decision that would hand their entire town millions of dollars. He wasn't waiting for anyone to figure that out. He'd arranged it himself, in secret, 22 years before he ever needed anyone to know. If stories about the quiet people who turn out to hold more than anyone ever guessed matter to you, subscribe to Karma Lullabies and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Geoffrey Holt was born in 1941 and spent essentially his entire life in and around Hinsdale, a small town tucked into the southwestern corner of New Hampshire, hard against the Vermont border. The kind of place where the Connecticut River marks the edge of town, and everyone genuinely does know everyone else, at least by sight. Hinsdale was never a wealthy town. It was a working one, built on mills and small industry, and the specific kind of quiet, unglamorous labor that kept dozens of towns like it running for most of the 20th century. For years, Holt worked as a production manager at a local Agway grain mill, the kind of steady, unglamorous industrial job that dozens of small New England towns depended on to keep their working population employed. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of career that got written up anywhere. It was simply reliable, and Holt was, by every account, left behind by people who worked alongside him. A capable and dependable presence on the floor. Then, sometime in the 1980s, the mill closed. It's the kind of story that played out in small towns across the country during that decade. A local employer shutting its doors, workers scattering to whatever came next, a piece of the town's economic backbone simply gone. For Holt, the closure came with a cash settlement, a payout tied to his years of service. Plenty of people in his position would have used that money to cover a rough stretch, patch a budget, or simply spend it down over a few years while looking for the next steady job. Geoffrey Holt did something else entirely. He took that settlement and invested it, quietly, in stocks and mutual funds, the same unglamorous, patient instruments that quiet fortune builders have leaned on for generations. And then, having planted that seed, he went and got himself a completely different kind of job. Holt became the groundskeeper at the mobile home park where he lived, a job that put him, quite literally, on the lowest rung of how most people mentally rank employment. He mowed lawns. He trimmed the common areas. He kept the property looking cared for, day after day, season after season, for people who paid him little mind beyond a nod when he rode past. He didn't own a car. Instead, he navigated the entire town on a riding lawnmower, an image so specific and so consistent over the years that it became, without him ever intending it to, the defining picture people carried of him. Ask a Hinsdale resident to describe Geoffrey Holt, and 9 times out of 10, the lawnmower comes up before his name does. He lived without a car and, by multiple accounts, without much furniture either, a level of deliberate austerity that read to almost everyone around him as poverty, rather than what it actually was, which was choice. He wasn't struggling to afford a couch. He had, by that point, already built a financial position most of his neighbors would never have guessed at in 100 years of guessing. He simply had no interest in filling his life with things that didn't matter to him, and a comfortable chair apparently didn't make that list. Winters in that corner of New Hampshire are not gentle. Snow piles up along Route 63 for months at a stretch, and the wind off the river cuts straight through anything less than a serious coat. People who remembered Holt from those years describe him bundled up, still making his rounds, still tending to what needed tending at the mobile home park, regardless of the season. A man whose relationship with discomfort seemed to be one of simple acceptance rather than complaint. He wasn't performing toughness for anyone's benefit. He genuinely didn't seem to need much, and what he did need, he provided for himself, on his own schedule, in his own way. People in town, when asked about him after the fact, almost universally described the same emotional reflex, a little bit of pity, a little bit of protective concern for the older man who seemed to have so little. Nobody in Hinsdale was ever cruel to Geoffrey Holt in any dramatic, headline-worthy way. There was no single villain in his story, no one moment of public humiliation. What there was, instead, was decades of a whole town, quietly, gently, almost affectionately underestimating a man who had already solved the one problem most of them spent their whole lives worrying about. There's something almost unbearably human about a town that felt sorry for a man who had already made sure their local hospital, library, and every school project for a generation would never have to ask twice. If that detail is landing the way it's landing for me, drop a comment and subscribe to Karma Lullabies, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Here is the detail that separates Geoffrey Holt's story from almost every other quiet fortune tale like it, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the entire shape of what happened. In 2001, more than 2 decades before his death, Holt didn't wait for a lawyer to eventually sort out his estate after he was gone. He walked, on his own initiative, into a relationship with the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and worked out an arrangement, while he was still very much alive and still riding that same lawnmower around town, for exactly how his money would be distributed once he was no longer around to distribute it himself. Think about what that actually means. Most of the quiet fortune stories that surface after someone dies involve family or executors piecing together the picture after the fact, discovering paperwork, tracing accounts, reconstructing decades of decisions after the person who made them is already gone. Geoffrey Holt didn't leave that work to chance. He sat down, decades in advance, with the exact same patience and deliberateness he'd apparently applied to every financial decision of his adult life, and he built the entire framework himself. He wasn't hoping his intentions would be understood correctly after he was gone. He made absolutely sure of it, 22 years ahead of schedule, and then he went right back to mowing lawns like nothing about his life had changed at all, because, for him, nothing really had. The money had never been the point of his day-to-day life. It had simply been quietly, carefully handled, the way everything else he touched seemed to be. For 22 more years, Geoffrey Holt kept living exactly the way he always had. Same mower, same modest home in the mobile home park he tended, same polite refusal of rides into town. He wasn't performing humility for anyone's benefit, and he certainly wasn't waiting for a dramatic reveal. He had simply already finished the most important financial decision of his life, decades before most people even start thinking seriously about their own. And then he let the rest of his life play out exactly as quietly as everything that came before it. Financial writers who later covered his story pointed out something that connects Geoffrey Holt to a small, quiet lineage of similar cases that occasionally surface in the news. A Vermont janitor who spent 60 years buying dividend stocks with a library card and left millions to his hospital and library. A Brooklyn legal secretary who copied her boss's trades for 67 years and left millions to a scholarship fund. And now a New Hampshire groundskeeper who rode a lawnmower instead of a car and quietly built a permanent endowment for his own town. None of them coordinated with each other. None of them read the same book on how to do it. What connects them is simpler and rarer than any strategy, a total, complete indifference to whether anyone around them ever knew what they were building, combined with a willingness to keep building it anyway, for decades, without an audience. What set Holt apart even within that small group was the deliberateness of the timing. Reed and Bloom's fortunes were pieced together by families and executors after the fact, discovered rather than announced. Holt built his own announcement in advance, on his own terms, while he still had decades left to keep living exactly the life he wanted, undisturbed by anyone's reaction to it. It's a small distinction, but it says something particular about a man who apparently wanted his money to matter more than his mystery. Geoffrey Holt died on June 6, 2023, at 82 years old, having spent more than 4 decades of his adult life in that same small stretch of southwestern New Hampshire, mowing lawns, riding his mower down the same familiar roads, and never once giving the town a reason to suspect there was anything more to his story than what they could see from the sidewalk. By then, he'd long since stopped being a mystery to the small circle of people who actually knew him well, though the true scale of what he'd built remained, even to some of them, only partially understood. He named a longtime friend, a man named Smith, as the executor of his estate, someone who had known him well enough to be trusted with carrying out instructions Holt had been quietly refining for over 2 decades. The town, in the immediate aftermath, mourned him the way small towns mourn a familiar face, who's been part of the daily scenery for as long as anyone can remember. The groundskeeper. The man on the moor. Somebody who'd been kind, unassuming, and present in that specific, low-key way that doesn't make headlines while it's happening. Nobody in Hinsdale was bracing for what came next, because nobody in Hinsdale had any real reason to expect it. Geoffrey Holt had spent 40 years making absolutely sure of that. There was a small, quiet period in the weeks right after his death where Hinsdale was simply a town that had lost a familiar fixture, nothing more complicated than that. The mobile home park needed a new groundskeeper. Route 63 had 1 fewer lawnmower on it most mornings. People who'd known him traded the small, warm, slightly sad stories that get traded about anyone who's been part of a town's daily texture for decades. The kind of stories that usually stay exactly that size and never grow into anything more than a fond, fading memory. Nobody was expecting a phone call from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Nobody was expecting a number with 6 zeros attached to it. The town simply went on, the way towns do, until the paperwork Holt had spent 22 years perfecting finally did what it had always been built to do. When the full picture of Geoffrey Holt's estate became public, the number was $3.8 million. Built from a single mill closure settlement in the 1980s, invested patiently across decades in stocks and mutual funds. Compounding quietly while its owner mowed a mobile home park's common areas for a living and refused rides into town on principle. It is, on its own, a stunning enough number for a man whose most visible daily habit was riding a lawnmower down a state highway instead of driving a car. What made it land even harder in Hinsdale specifically was the instruction attached to it. Geoffrey Holt hadn't split his fortune quietly among a handful of relatives or funneled it into a single distant cause, disconnected from the place he'd actually lived his life. He directed the entire $3.8 million toward the town itself, structured through the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation as an endowment, with the interest made available every single year for grants supporting health. education, culture, and recreation throughout Hinsdale. Local officials estimated the fund would generate somewhere in the neighborhood of $150,000 annually that the town and its community organizations could apply for indefinitely, a permanent, self-renewing gift from a man most residents remembered primarily for turning down a ride in the rain. For a town the size of Hinsdale, a place without a large tax base or a wealthy benefactor class to draw on, $150,000 a year in available grant funding isn't a rounding error. It's the kind of money that funds playground equipment, covers gaps in a school arts program, helps a food pantry get through a hard winter, or supports a health initiative that would otherwise have been quietly shelved for lack of budget. It's not a single dramatic gesture. It's 40, 50, 60 years of small, unglamorous civic improvements, arriving one grant application at a time, indefinitely, because one groundskeeper decided his town's ordinary needs mattered more than his own comfort while he was alive to provide for them. Compare that to the alternative version of this story, the one that almost happened and never did. Geoffrey Holt could have died the way plenty of quietly wealthy, elderly people die, without a clear plan, without a charitable structure already built and tested, leaving a tangle of accounts for a probate court to sort out over months or years, while distant relatives and lawyers argued over what should happen to money nobody knew existed. That version of the story happens constantly, and it rarely ends with a town receiving a permanent endowment. It ends with legal fees, delays, and often, eventually, a fortune scattered in directions the person who built it never actually intended. Holt's 22 years of advanced planning is the entire reason his story ended the way it did instead. The generosity was real, but so was the structural discipline underneath it, and one without the other would have left Hinsdale with considerably less than $3.8 million and a great deal more legal paperwork. News of Geoffrey Holt's estate moved through Hinsdale fast, and then it moved well beyond Hinsdale, picked up by regional papers, then wire services, then national outlets, all drawn to the same almost impossible shape of the story: a groundskeeper, a lawnmower instead of a car, no furniture. $3.8 million willed entirely to the town that had, for decades, quietly felt sorry for him. It's the kind of headline that stops people mid-scroll, because it asks an uncomfortable question of every reader who's ever driven past someone they assumed had nothing and never once wondered if that assumption might be wrong. Reporters who came through Hinsdale in the days after the story broke found a town that was, in equal measure, proud and a little unsettled. Proud, because the money was real and the intent behind it was as generous as anything a small town like theirs was ever likely to receive. Unsettled, because it forced an uncomfortable kind of self-audit, a running back through years of small interactions, looking for a moment where someone, anyone, might have treated Geoffrey Holt with more warmth, more curiosity, more basic attention. If only they'd known what he was actually carrying. People who'd known Holt for years found themselves re-examining the small, ordinary interactions that had made up their entire relationship with him. The mobile home park residents, whose lawns he'd mowed for free labor's worth of a paycheck, never once hinting at what sat behind it. The people who'd offered him rides and been politely waved off, never suspecting the refusal, had nothing to do with need, and everything to do with a man who simply preferred his mower. The town officials, who would later administer a fund most of them had no idea was even being built right under their noses for over 2 decades. There was no cruelty in Geoffrey Holt's story in any dramatic sense, and that might be the detail that makes it linger the longest. Nobody mocked him publicly. Nobody humiliated him in front of a crowd. The only thing anyone in Hinsdale is really guilty of is the same soft, well-meaning underestimation that happens in small towns everywhere. The quiet assumption that a man on a lawnmower with no furniture in his house has nothing left to give anyone, when in fact he'd already given more thought to his town's future than most of the people mowing their own lawns beside him. You could hear the same recalibration happening in almost every quote that made it into the local coverage afterward.
I feel terrible now, thinking about how many times I felt sorry for that man. We used to joke about him a little, not meanly, just, small town stuff. I think about that differently now.
He mowed my mother's lot for years, never charged extra for the parts she asked special for. I had no idea. Nobody said any of it with malice. That was almost the hardest part to sit with. An entire town, gently, affectionately wrong about a man for decades, and not one person in that chorus had ever meant him any harm at all. Money placed into a permanent charitable endowment doesn't disappear in a single splashy announcement and then vanish from the story. It keeps working, year after year, in exactly the patient, compounding way Geoffrey Holt clearly understood better than almost anyone around him. Every year, going forward, indefinitely, Hinsdale schools, its healthcare programs, its cultural organizations, and its recreational programs can apply for grants drawn from the interest on a fund that didn't exist in any organized form until a groundskeeper with a lawnmower decided, in 2001, that his town deserved a permanent safety net nobody had asked him to build. That structure says almost as much about Holt as the number itself. He didn't hand the town a single limp sum meant to be spent down and forgotten within a few budget cycles. He built something designed to outlast him by generations, a fund that will still be quietly supporting Hinsdale long after everyone who ever offered him a ride in the rain has been gone themselves. It is, in its own understated way, the exact same philosophy that built the fortune in the first place. Patient, structural, built to compound rather than to impress anyone in the moment. The New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, which had worked with Holt personally for over 2 decades by the time he died, understood the shape of his intentions better than almost anyone, having watched him build the framework methodically, one careful decision at a time, long before there was any urgency attached to finishing it. For them, his death wasn't the beginning of a mystery to solve. It was simply the moment the plan they'd already helped him build finally activated exactly the way he'd designed it to. Foundation staff who had corresponded with Holt over the years described him consistently as thoughtful, precise, and completely unsentimental about the process. A man who wanted to understand exactly how an endowment worked, exactly how the grant application process would function for the town's organizations, and exactly how the fund would be protected and grown over time before he ever signed anything. He treated the creation of a permanent charitable structure for Hinsdale with the same careful, patient attention he'd apparently brought to picking dividend-paying investments decades earlier. It wasn't a whim, and it wasn't a deathbed gesture. It was a project, built with the same discipline as everything else in his life, just aimed, this time, entirely outward. There's a particular kind of dismissal that doesn't require a single unkind word, and Geoffrey Holt absorbed it for decades without ever once correcting the record. It's the dismissal built into watching a man mow lawns for a living and assuming that's the full ceiling of his life. It's the dismissal built into seeing someone without a car and filing them, instantly and permanently, under a category that has nothing to do with who they actually are. It's the quiet, well-intentioned pity that so many people in Hinsdale apparently felt for a man who, it turned out, had already secured their town's future before most of them had finished their morning coffee that day in 2001. None of it was ever true, and Holt never once seemed interested in correcting it while he was alive to do so. He didn't need the town to see what he'd built. He needed it to exist, ready and waiting for the exact moment he'd already planned for. 22 years in advance, with the same patient discipline he brought to every single financial decision he ever made. There's a specific kind of freedom in that, one most people never get to experience, because most people, even the genuinely generous ones, want some acknowledgement of their generosity, while they're still around to receive it. Geoffrey Holt appears to have wanted none of that at all. He wanted the mill settlement invested well. He wanted the mobile home park's lawns cut properly. He wanted his town's future secured, structurally, permanently, whether or not a single person ever connected his name to it, while he could still hear them say it. 2 out of those 3 things happened in complete privacy for over 40 years. Only the third one, the one he'd built specifically to outlast him, was ever meant to become public at all. If Geoffrey Holt's story taught you anything about how easily we mistake simplicity for emptiness, say so in the comments, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to Karma Lullabies, because this is exactly the kind of quiet, powerful story we tell here every week. Geoffrey Holt never sat for an interview explaining his investment philosophy. He never corrected a single person who offered him a ride out of pity, or gently suggested he might want a proper couch. He simply lived the exact life he wanted, on the exact terms he'd chosen, right up until the day he died, and let the paperwork he'd finished decades earlier do all the explaining afterward. Precisely, and without a wasted word. Somewhere in Hinsdale, New Hampshire, right now, a school program or a health initiative or a local cultural project is quietly better funded because a groundskeeper decided, back in 2001, that his town's future mattered more than anyone ever knowing his name while he was alive to hear it. He never needed the town to understand what he was building. He only needed it to be there when they finally did. Think about the last person you drove past without a second glance. The one doing work that doesn't get noticed, wearing clothes that don't impress anyone, moving through the world in a way that made you file them, instantly and without evidence, under a category you never bothered to actually check. Geoffrey Holt spent 40 years being exactly that person to almost everyone who ever saw him, and he spent every one of those years quietly building something that would outlast every assumption anyone in Hinsdale ever made about him. And somewhere on Route 63, if you ask the right person, they'll still tell you, half fondly and half in disbelief, about the man who used to ride past on a lawnmower, looking like he had nothing at all, while quietly carrying an entire town's future in his back pocket the whole time.